Working and renting in her 70s, Jane never even dreamed of owning her own home. But a parting gift from her generous landlord has changed her life forever.
Jane Sainer had spent years living modestly in Melbourne, moving between rentals that never quite felt like home. Some were too noisy, others too cramped. But one Saturday morning in 1999, while walking through the quiet suburb of St. Albans, northwest of Melbourne's city centre, she noticed something that made her pause. A small handwritten sign taped to the fence of an old weatherboard unit. For rent. The house wasn't anything special by most standards. A two-bedroom unit with a patchy lawn and an overgrown garden, the front gate barely hanging on its hinges. But something stirred inside her. Maybe it was the way the garden caught the sunlight or the stillness of the street. Maybe it was just timing. She scribbled down the number and called that afternoon. An older man answered. His name was John Perrett. The rent, he said, was $200 per week. Jane hesitated. That was low, even then. Is there a catch? She asked. No catch, John replied. I like to keep things simple. She visited the next day. John met her outside the unit. He was in his early 60s, quiet-spoken, with a calm presence and a strong handshake. They spoke for only 20 minutes. 2 days later, Jane got a call. You're in, John said. Just look after the garden. Jane moved in a week later. As she unpacked her few belongings, she opened the sliding glass door and stepped into the backyard. Weeds curled around the flower beds, the soil dry and cracked. Still, she smiled. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. The years passed quickly, marked not by big events, but by a rhythm Jane came to love. She never missed rent. $200 in cash slipped into an envelope and left in the mailbox just like John asked. The rent never changed. Not once. Even as the housing market exploded across Melbourne, even as neighbors came and went, Jane's rent remained the same for over 2 decades. Each morning began at 3 a.m. Jane would wait quietly, pull on her worn work clothes, and head to Epping Market, northeast of the city. There she worked long shifts selling fruit, flowers, or packaged goods, depending on the season. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She'd return home by early afternoon, tired but satisfied. And always the garden waited. She planted lavender, tomatoes, and parsley. She shaped the edges, pulled weeds, and turned soil every weekend. The garden that once looked forgotten now bloomed with color and life. Jane didn't socialize much. She kept to herself, waved at neighbors, but rarely went out. Her joy came from her home, the routine, and that little green space in the backyard. She never missed a payment, never filed a complaint, and never once thought about leaving. She thought often about John, though. He didn't visit often, but every now and then he'd drop by quietly to check the gutters or trim the tree out front. How are things, he'd ask. Still perfect, she'd answer. What Jane never asked, and what rarely crossed her mind, was what would happen if something happened to him. John was clearly older. By 2019, he seemed slower. She knew he had health problems, though he never spoke much about it. She hoped quietly that she'd be able to stay in the unit until she couldn't live alone anymore. But in the background, things were changing. John Perrett wasn't just a landlord. In his younger years, he had been a pharmacist in Melbourne. A smart man with an eye for business, he'd also been a semi-professional football player and later a property investor. He never married, never had children, but had slowly and quietly built a fortune through real estate and investments. In the 1980s, John's health had taken a sudden turn. He was diagnosed with kidney failure. It was a difficult period requiring dialysis and extended hospital stays. Then came the miracle. A kidney transplant at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. The surgery saved his life. The doctors told him the kidney might last a decade if he was lucky. It lasted over 30 years. That experience changed him. He became a quiet philanthropist, donating to hospitals and local causes under the radar, but he never lost his simplicity. He lived modestly, didn't show off, and didn't talk about his money. By 2020, John had moved into a nursing home battling Parkinson's disease. He was in his mid-80s now and knew his time was limited. He began getting his affairs in order. One day he asked the nurse to bring him his solicitor. Then he asked for Jane's number. It was a regular afternoon when Jane's phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, though slower and raspier than she remembered. "Jane, it's John," he said. "Oh, hi, John. How are you?" There was a pause. Then came words she didn't expect. "I've got my solicitor here with me. Can you please give him your full name?" Jane hesitated. "Why?" "Because," John said gently, "I'm leaving you the unit."
Phone call from him one day and said, "I want to talk to my solicitor. He's here at the moment, and can you give him your full name? Because I'm leaving you the unit."
She stood frozen in her kitchen in St. Albans, holding the phone in one hand, a sponge in the other. "You're what?" "I want you to have it. You've been a good tenant, always paid on time, looked after the place. It's yours." Jane didn't know what to say. The conversation was short, practical. She hung up in a daze, staring out at the garden she had nurtured for 22 years. The garden that was now hers. She sat down and tried to process what had just happened. Was it a joke, a mistake? But it wasn't. Within days, she was in touch with the solicitor. Papers were drawn up. Jane's name was added as the legal owner of the property. "I still sometimes think, did this really happen?" she later told reporters, but it had. After a lifetime of renting, budgeting, and working, Jane Sainer now owned her home. And she hadn't paid a cent more than her weekly rent. Not long after that call, John Parrott passed away in September 2020. He was 86 years old. Jane cried quietly when she heard the news. She hadn't known it would be their last conversation. She walked outside, sat on the garden bench, and whispered, "Thank you, John." But Jane wasn't the only one whose life had changed because of him. As news of his passing spread, so did the details of what he'd done. John had donated $19.6 million, nearly his entire estate, to the Royal Melbourne Hospital's nephrology department, the same place that had given him a second chance all those years ago.
It seems not many knew of John's good fortune until it belonged to others, not just Jane, but patients here at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, where he donated $19.6 million.
Doctors and staff were stunned. Words can almost never describe how unselfish and incredibly generous John Parrott is, said Professor Nigel Toussaint from the hospital. "It's just amazing." John's donation was the largest single bequest the department had ever received. It would fund research, treatment, and support for countless patients in the years to come. That kidney transplant lasted 30-plus years, Toussaint said, and it was still functioning when he passed away. That was a life-saving gift, and clearly, he never forgot it. His gift wasn't about legacy. It wasn't about recognition. It was simply gratitude for a life extended, for the care he received, for the opportunity to give back. By early 2021, Jane had finally retired. She no longer woke at 3 a.m. to work the stalls at Epping Market. Her days were slower now. Her hands, once worn from work, were used to trim hedges and repot flowers. Each morning she stepped out into the garden, the same garden she had tended for over 2 decades. The same soil, now hers. "I thank him still, every day of my life," Jane said in an interview, just privately. "I say, thanks, John." The house in St. Albans hadn't changed much, but to Jane it was everything. She didn't see herself as lucky, she saw herself as blessed. She had worked hard, lived quietly, and expected little. And in return, someone noticed. Someone chose to give back. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Today, the Royal Melbourne Hospital continues to benefit from John's gift. His story is shared among staff, not just as a record-breaking donation, but as a reminder of what kindness can do. And in a quiet garden in St. Albans, one woman waters her lavender and smiles. She never asked for more, but she was given more than she ever dreamed. What would you have done if you were in Jane's shoes? Would you have believed that phone call? And do you think John's act of kindness is something we see enough of in today's world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story moving, give it a like, subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire, and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload.